Yeah, I told you.
Hello! We are live on University Radio Nottingham for The Big Picture with Felix Hawes
and Thomas Gregory.
Joining us today we have George.
Hello, good afternoon.
And Damien.
Hello.
Well, today our topics are the police investigation of the Downing Street parties and the ever-elusive Sue Gray report that we're eagerly awaiting for. I did expect that we would have it to talk about it on this week's show, but we are still waiting.
George is just destroying the microphone.
Microphone, brilliant. We'll also be talking about the Russia-Ukraine situation. Russia has got 106,000 soldiers, according to British intelligence, on the Ukrainian border, and we'll also be talking about Islamophobia in the Conservative Party. So first of all, after quite a long time of people waiting or speculating why the Met Police have not investigated the parties, they have said that they are now going to investigate because they've been handed some rather incriminating data by Sue Gray, and this has resulted in the Sue Gray report being delayed because the Metropolitan Police has said that some parts of the Sue Gray report can't be released because of legal reasons, that you can't have witnesses being revealed to the public because it could affect other witnesses' testimonies. This is the second time in over 100 years that the police have investigated Downing Street, the other one being Tony Blair with the Cash for Honours scandal in 2006. Quite a serious thing going on here. What do you make of it? What do you think about the police investigation? When do you think we're going to get the Sue Gray report? And as we seem to be asking this question every week now, is Boris Johnson going to keep going on as being Prime Minister?
Well, personally, I'd like to see a little bit more transparency in the way in which the head of the Metropolitan Police is appointed. There seems to be far too much connection or close proximity between Downing Street and the head of the Met Police. Don't forget that earlier last year now, Boris Johnson described Chris Dick as the candidate for continuity, which in itself is not a ringing endorsement. but there is clearly a close proximity between the two, and it has been suggested by not just DJs on this radio station, but radio stations nationally, that there was a bit of political manoeuvring in trying to bring about this investigation to so-called kick the can down the road. So I think a lot of the Metropolitan Police's involvement, after initially declaring that it wasn't going to be participating or investigating into the parties that took place in Downing Street over the last 2 years, has now changed. I think that's actually a political tactic rather than the Metropolitan Police having a change of mind. As far as I'm aware, it works very similarly with the Crown Prosecution Service. When an investigation is discontinued, that there is an appeals process, but I haven't managed to find any evidence that an appeal was made by Downing Street or any other group that was put forward. So I think you've got to look at the contributing factors, and you've got to look at the lowest common denominator, and that's got to be that it's a political tactic.
George, what do you think to that?
Oh no, I mean, yeah,
political tactic.
I mean, could the Met Police get any more unpopular?
I don't know.
you tell us,
Yeah.
George.
Just the sheer audacity of it all, really. I mean, yeah.
Yes.
Do you think that, there was allegations made that after the Sarah Everard murder by a serving police officer and Cressida Dick remaining in office, that there is some sort of, this is all hearsay and rumour, but it has been alleged that she's still in office because of Boris Johnson, and therefore this is a sort of a favour, but now she's sort of been pressured into it by projects like the Good Law Project, which is a rather Ramona left-wing group that often fail. But
if you piece it all together, it doesn't really look like a conspiracy theory, does it?
Well, I'd just like to say that the original way in which the British police was set up by Robert Peel, some nearly 400 years ago, it was not supposed to be an agent of the state. It was supposed to be for the enforcement of law and the protection of citizens. And I think the over the last 2 years, we've seen increasingly politicised policing, and again a close proximity between Westminster and Downing Street, and interjecting with the Metropolitan Police. I don't know if this is a values thing, but to me it's not the way in which I like to see policing done in Britain. And again, trying to find that crux of evidence that this is somehow it's come from the Metropolitan Police and not from Downing Street, trying to sort of find the ferret in the trousers, I suppose. I couldn't find it. I've tried to do loads of research for this since these debate topics came up. I couldn't find any evidence. So there was no appeals press. You go on the Metropolitan Police website. Obviously, I did not have the time to put in a freedom of information request because that's a very long bureaucratic process, and I have got other things going on in my life. But yeah, so you can ask these questions directly to the Metropolitan Police, but you'll probably just get a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of noise in an email, and not very much in the way of clarity, especially if you're a journalist. So that is a bit of a shame.
Do you think we should have the police and crime commissioners, which is an elected position? I think they're elected every 4 years. Do you think, and that they are politicised as well with different parties running, do you think these are the sort of things that we should be getting rid of? Or do you think that actually these police and crime commissioners add a bit of accountability to the police, which are obviously an incredibly important and vital state institution that are unelected?
Well, they're meant to give accountability, Felix, but when do you ever see them? Do you even know who your local police and crime commissioner is?
No, I do not know.
Well, that says a lot, sort of.
I believe
in itself,
actually
doesn't it?
A little statistic and fact that I think the 2011 police and crime commissioners, there was one polling station that no one turned up to vote.
Well, this was my next.
But that's exactly it, right?
Yeah.
It's not necessarily their fault. It's just that people don't really care. Is that the?
Well, I'd just try to interject that it's not necessarily the police and crime commissioners thing. I think it's a bit of a misnomer that they have that amount of influence. In fact, this week came out the shocking statistic that 6% of crimes in Britain are actually charged. That's not prosecuted, that's just charged. And all of this has to do with the fact that all criminal investigations are passed over to the Crown Prosecution Service, which has a very, very complicated legal process they have to go through when looking at evidence, when looking at what's in the public interest to prosecute. And the fact of the matter is, if you have any dealings with the police or speak to police officers and ask them their opinions, if you have the chance on the Crown Prosecution Service, it's actually them that are the blockade in our justice system, not necessarily the police, although there are, of course, criticisms that can be made with the police as well. But in terms of actually having any faith or connectivity with any idea of law or justice in this country, I'd definitely point the finger at reform of the Crown Prosecution Service rather than the police.
Well, on top of that, actually, is also a load of lawyers have come out and said that they're pretty irate about the fact that there's so little money for representation in the criminal justice system, and so maybe it's a matter of investment too. That's
over the last 10 years, the areas in which one can get legal aid have been slowly cut. You still obviously get legal aid if you're charged, but there used to be legal aid in civil matters if it couldn't be resolved via the Crown Prosecution Service in the criminal justice system, because obviously there are various things that cross over. Ideas of assault and battery are obviously things that are looked at in the criminal system as well, and you can seek recourse through the civil courts, but you can't get legal aid. And the fact is, most people can't afford legal aid, and if you're trying to set a new legal precedent or it's a particularly complicated case, the chances of you have to pay the other side's costs if you lose are actually quite high. And they're at least not a statistic that the regular common man would risk paying, and thus he's cut out of any sort of restitution for what's happened to him. But that's a more broad legal argument rather than what we're talking about with the police and crime commissioners, like I said.
Moving on to the Sue Gray report. We were originally, Laura Koonsberg reported we were going to have it on Wednesday, just before Prime Minister's questions. Yet we are still waiting. The Metropolitan Police have asked for Sue Gray to remove certain aspects of the report that they are also investigating. Is Sue Gray's report going to be very minimal now, and when are we actually going to get it? because this is the crux for many Conservative MPs, whether or not they submit the vote of no confidence in Boris Johnson. 54 needed.
Yeah.
And Tom Tugendhat has announced today, I don't know if you've seen it yet, that
I spotted it. It was me.
Thomas did spot this, when we were in the library earlier today, that he has announced that he will stand in a leadership contest if it does occur. So there are rumblings that this is likely to happen, perhaps, if someone's actually saying they're going to stand in this election. When do you think we're going to see the Sue Gray report? And do you think it's actually going to be as influential as we previously thought now there is an investigation by the Metropolitan Police?
Well, I've struggled to see what parliamentary committees Sue Gray's actually a member of, and it's only usually parliamentary committees that you tend to have an effect. I know that we're going to get on to Islamophobia in the Conservative Party, but that was the EHRC that had to deal with that, the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which is a parliamentary committee. I don't know what the process is for things being redacted, whether it's all to do with political manoeuvring. I have to say I've lost quite a lot of faith with there being any transparency when it comes to the Prime Minister's office, which is where all this is taking place. And again, who's to say what influence Boris Johnson has, what influence other members of the cabinet have over what's actually published? Because I'm sure you guys will probably agree that it's probably not just Boris Johnson that's been up to no good breaking coronavirus restrictions. Who else is
Keir
trying to
Starmer, maybe?
Well, yeah,
There's a bit of debate over that.
It'd be funny to see him at number 10 breaking that. That would
to be honest,
in the same barrel.
It does seem to be a wider number 10 culture that Boris Johnson has presided over, and it does most of these allegations and parties that are being investigated, Boris Johnson was not at. But I think one of the levels of criticism is this has happened under his watch, that he must have been aware and that no one was sacked or reprimanded for their actions. Sue Gray is on the ethics, I believe. She's on the ethics committee or works on the ethics department in the civil service. She is renowned for being quite ruthless. She sacked a 26-year-old for using their parliamentary email to invite some people around for a party or something private, and she sacked him for that.
That must mean then Boris is going to be killed.
She is apparently very, again, hearsay rumour, the Twitter bubble is saying that Sue Gray's report was very critical of Boris Johnson, but of course a lot of this now has to be removed because the Metropolitan Police have requested it to be removed because of if you have witnesses, if other people in the investigation that the police need to interview see what other people have said from the Sue Gray report, then it could influence their judgment on what they say. Just like in a courtroom, you don't have witnesses seeing what other witnesses have said, just in case it affects their testimonies.
So basically, because of this, Boris allowing a few parties to happen, we've had this whole turmoil about the police now getting involved with it, and now we're asking you boys. When's the report coming out, and what do you reckon is going to happen to Boris the Teflon Houdini Johnson?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, Mr. Alexander Diffeffel. Yeah, no, I honestly think, regardless of what comes out, whether it's in the next week or so, he's a bit of a Teflon, isn't he? I think he somehow managed to worm his way out of this.
But he's taken more flack for this though than. There must be other people involved who are way more deep into this and that are going to get significant fines going on.
Or is he going to sack any of them?
Or are we going to...
the one who invited people to party, the bring your own booze. Boris Johnson said he had full confidence in Martin Reynolds. So I think a lot of the criticism is the fact that Boris Johnson's not sacking anyone.
It would be a complete joke though if Boris Johnson sacked someone, even though he's the man in charge and he was the one who broke all the laws himself.
I suppose my question is whether you think it would be appropriate now to, if they don't get fined, whether it would be appropriate to reimburse all the people that did get fined.
Definitely.
Could you do that?
Definitely.
Legally, is that allowed to do that? Since it was the law, right?
You have to launch a civil case, as far as I'm aware, in which you would then set a precedent for it to be challenged in the criminal courts. You'd have to do it with the civil case. I'm not a legal expert, although I was banging on about CPS a second ago. It'd be very hard to challenge. You can do class action lawsuits in the UK, but they're incredibly difficult to set up, like they are in the United States. They could. The easiest way that I know of is to introduce legislation that would alleviate the fines and reimburse the fines. You can introduce secondary legislation quite simply that would allow the fines to be repaid.
But it's all a bit of a faff, isn't it? Maybe we shouldn't have had fines in the first place.
I agree completely.
Right, you're both nodding. So both of you don't think we should have had fines in the first place.
I consistently and deliberately broke every lockdown restriction since they were introduced, so I don't mind saying
He's saying that live on URA.
I don't mind saying that. I thought it was all...
Sue Gray, you're going to be listening because we got another one to add to the
Exactly, yeah.
No, I'm a guest, so I didn't think I had to... stick by the same code. I thought I was being controlled by the two lovely hosts.
I mean,
I
wouldn't say I was completely against it at the time. You know, I thought obviously this was such an unknown. Like I keep saying, I did fully back the COVID restrictions. You know, going into the unknown at the beginning. But obviously, everything that's come out since with Partygate, etc., etc. Yes, I don't know how you go about it because I'm not no legal expert or anything, but. Yeah, no, definitely people should be reimbursed, and people were publicly shamed for that as well. So,
I mean, what situation will be in if the Prime Minister of this country is fined for breaking the law and he's still? I mean, MPs.
Yeah, but then would it be fair for him to be sacked out of his job just because he attended a party? Because maybe the laws themselves.
But he set the laws.
According to a lot of
the laws.
Yeah, but
we have MPs that are still sitting in the House of Parliament that have actually been convicted of crimes, never mind just fined for a misdemeanor.
Okay, right.
Like Claudia Webb. So
yeah, that is true.
Not that I would endorse that either. I don't see how any party with any moral standing could endorse a candidate that's been convicted, which is incredibly hard to do, as I've already explained, of harassment, and then still allowed to represent her constituency.
There's that Tory MP as well. What's his name? The Burton one. Has he been convicted?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, for some kind of
sexual
assault.
Then Imran
thing.
Khan for Wakefield.
Yeah, he's a lord now, isn't it? No, who am I thinking of?
I don't know who you're thinking of.
No.
The Imran Khan has been charged for sexual assault of a young boy. Bob,
yes.
Him, Imran Khan.
Yeah,
he's been expelled from the Conservative Party, but he's still an MP, yeah. Because the recall petition hasn't worked or hasn't been enacted or something along those lines. That's. No,
I was thinking of someone else. He's now a lord. He's a former Labour, MP, but he's a lord now. You know what I mean, don't you?
Yeah, I'm not.
He assaulted a young boy, and then he assaulted, and then there was a news light on it, and he basically.
And he's in the Lords. Yeah.
Yeah.
So maybe, again, it comes back to this all the time. Do you reckon that we're in an atmosphere where we have the least amount of public confidence in the government than maybe in a long time?
Yeah, actually, polling has shown that it's the most since 1974. The mistrust in politicians.
Wow.
I mean, this is more now than Brexit and expenses.
And even the winter of discontent.
Yeah,
that is damning.
I don't
Surely
know.
that is damning.
I'm surprised that everyone was surprised, and I think a large amount of people are acting surprised because that's the expected thing to do. I was saying back in 2020, I said there's no way that the people that are actually in government are going to be abiding by these rules the way in which we're expected to. I mean, let us not forget the Scotch egg scandal, for instance. I mean, do you really think that was necessarily adhered to within the parliamentary bar?
What do you mean by the Scotch egg scandal?
So when they introduced the bit of a restriction that you had to have a substantial meal with alcohol.
With
alcohol.
Scotch egg, a substantial meal.
I just thought there's no way that people that are beyond the reach of the law, which is essentially how I see parliamentarians and the people that work within Downing Street are going to abide by this. I thought it's ridiculous. And apparently the rule of 6 was voted on in the cabinet with a raise of hands. It was between 8 and 6, both of which numbers I don't believe were arrived on in any scientific way.
But also, isn't it the case that the law doesn't apply to actual Parliament land? Is there something I read about that?
Crown land, certain rules don't have to apply.
So maybe maybe they didn't break the law because the law didn't apply to them. I don't know. Well,
the public still think it stinks.
That is a technicality, but he did say I didn't break the law, so maybe he already knows this. Who knows?
It's the misleading of Parliament that I think is the big one, isn't it?
Frankly, at the end of the day, Boris Johnson really he's been gambling with his leadership, and you could say maybe he's been playing roulette with his candidacy. So here you go.
And his policies.
Here's Springsteen.
Ooh.
With the song Roulette. Absolute banger from Bruce Springsteen there. That's about the 3 Mile Island incident and a fireman running away from it to kind of protect his family, if you're listening or if you care. Now we're going to move on to Russia and Ukraine. Oh dear, it just gets worse.
Are we on the brink of war then, do you think? 106,000 troops on the Ukrainian border is what British intelligence reckon. The invasion could occur next week. There's also been a lot of fragmentation on the West on this. You've got Joe Biden originally saying, we wouldn't do anything if it was an incursion, only if it's an invasion.
A minor incursion.
What is an incursion?
He said minor incursion.
A minor incursion. What's the difference between a minor incursion and an invasion? Germany is refusing any Royal Air Force planes to fly over
I'm amazed
to provide
by
the
that.
Ukrainians military equipment. And France, of course, is kicking off. Doesn't really like NATO. Of course, it left NATO for about 40 years, only rejoining in 2009, because France wants a European army to instead of NATO. So we've got a bit of fragmentation on the West. We've got Russia being aggressive, and of course, if Russia does invade Ukraine and the West doesn't do anything, does this inspire China to enact war on Taiwan? So there's a lot of geopolitical consequences. What do you think is going to happen? Are we expecting an invasion?
Well, I'd just like to say, you talked about Biden sort of contradicting himself, and I got one statement from him from a press conference. He said Russia will be held accountable and allies will be ready to take action if they invade Ukraine. I still think he, meaning Vladimir Putin, does not want a full-blown war. Will he test the US and NATO? I think he will, but he'll pay a serious and dear price for it.
That was far too coherent. That's got to be maybe it was a bit more stuttery than perhaps I read it out. But I would just like a little bit more clarity from the leader of the free world on whether or not we are going to war with the second or third largest nuclear superpower in the world. I would probably like a bit more clarity on that before I make up my mind on whether I'm going to say there's going to be a full-blown war or not. I mean, using phrases like full-blown war are not phrases that are generally used in foreign policy circles. It's a bit of an amateur phrase.
A lot of bang bang and boom boom.
It's a bit, I won't say megalomaniacal, but it's not exactly the kind of language that instills confidence. Sergei Lavrov,
God, George is destroying this studio. It's really very funny.
I don't know. That's why I just don't touch them, because they always the microphones always fall over. It was Sergei Lavrov in response to the Russian foreign minister, who's been relatively conservative in his remarks, although he's repeatedly set out Russia's red lines, one of which is NATO troops in Ukraine, which have not yet been deployed, although that could be a sign as to whether or not they're sort of giving guaranteeship on the fact that they're not going to let the Baltic states leave NATO. So there's political posturing even in that, even though that is sort of meeting Ukraine halfway. The other demand was reduced activity of NATO in the Black Sea, which I actually bothered to get the Istanbul logs, because obviously there's only one canal that can actually grant anyone access to the Red Sea. And the Black Sea, and there's a huge amount of NATO activity. Back in, I think it was June last year, HMS Defender went within 3 miles of the Crimean coast. And whilst international bodies do not recognise Crimea as part of Russian territory, to anybody that's interested in realpolitik, the Russians definitely think it is. And it's actually only an international trading route, and the last time I checked, HMS Defender was not a cargo ship. So I think there could be a little bit more diplomacy from the West here, a bit more clarity, and also one of the statements made, which I bought so many notes, it's going to be impossible to find this one little quote.
This is very impressive preparation.
I know. I feel
it was the quote that obviously Putin has sort of dubiously said a few times that when Mikhail Gorbachev was being negotiated with to close down the Soviet Union, one of the guarantees that NATO would not expand into the satellite states. Now, that's not quite true. It was more that they weren't going to move into East Germany, but also Mikhail Gorbachev said in the spirit of the negotiations, it was also implied that they wouldn't do that.
He said that in 2014, didn't he?
Yeah. But they then did, so it's very up in the air. But and for someone like Putin, that's a very easy statement to manipulate, because it was very muddied in the first place back in the early 90s. But one of the guarantees, because there's current negotiations going on, and this, I think we're in the second day now. One of the things the US will not back down on is the fact that NATO doesn't have a right to expand wherever it wants, and for Russia they simply can't tolerate it. So it's an immovable force versus it's unstoppable force versus an immovable object.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting you say that. As some of us politics students, it's definitely the case that Ukraine is treated as a buffer state, and so it's obviously hot in contest, and it is the case that Russia arguably wants more recognition as a superpower, and maybe it is the case that NATO is pushing its luck. But if Ukraine wants NATO to be involved, that's important. And also on the point of Biden and the way he kind of speaks, I do find that he's very kind of friendly in his manner, and maybe that could be weaker as a war president. Who knows, George?
Well, for me, this whole thing, the struggle between Russia and the West, a lot of it for me, Ukraine's agency doesn't get taken into consideration. You know, they're a sovereign state. They're very much a country in their own right, and it's not. I don't think it's either the West or Russia to try and muscle in and have influence. And I believe that every sovereign state should be able to follow their own destiny, their own path. It looks like that Ukraine wants to join NATO, but
the issue with that is that there isn't self-determination in a vacuum. There are always outside influences to some extent. Yes, one would like to respect the self-determination of nations, but the fact is a place like Ukraine, one of the most hotly contested pieces of land on the planet. Zbigniew Brzezinski, who is Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, wrote a book called The Grand Chessboard, where he talked about this in great length when it was still part of the Soviet Union, that in terms of territory and access it grants to other parts of the world, including the Middle East, it's essentially the most important part of Eurasia, both for Russia as a superpower and for NATO, or now the EU as a superpower. So it's one of those places that's one might call it the new Holy Land in terms of foreign policy.
Is it right though that if Russia, maybe we could say that its dislike of NATO and believing NATO's broken promises is founded in evidence and can be justified? But is it right then, even if that is justifiable, to counter that by invading another sovereign state, Ukraine, which has done nothing wrong, but it's just going to be the collateral damage of Russia to try and control NATO and its actions in the waters around Russia and its aim of expanding?
Well, there's all this buffer state stuff, right? But I found out only 6% of Ukraine's land borders touch NATO countries, which is a pretty small percentage, and Russia has land borders with 14 countries. Only 5 of them are NATO members. Outside of the NATO territory, the alliance only has a military presence in Kosovo and Iraq.
Well, there you go. So is this just Russia's excuse? Because, as Thomas was alluding to, is Vladimir Putin thinking, actually, Russia isn't really much of a superpower as it used to be. It's dominated by the US and China by a long way. Arguably, you could say that many members of the European Union are now far above Russia in terms of power. That it's trying to make a name for itself again because it feels that, or Putin feels that, it's not treated in the same way as
its only method. It's its only method of diplomacy. Its economy is incredibly small. Its only method of diplomacy is sadly using its muscles, its military muscles, because it's not really got anything else to influence the way it's treated.
A lot of that they've brought upon themselves, haven't they?
The other point is of course that Russia plays on the fact that there is a substantial number of people in eastern Ukraine that are in support of Russia, and on the news it was saying how some are completely apathetic about Russia's involvement, whereas others are really mixed. So the concept of a sovereign state, this is obviously talking about majority public opinion and not complete public opinion, because of course there are people within those countries that would contest where Russia should lose its border with Ukraine, because that is Ukraine, of course, was not, but is like all states have been created in its
Russia
boundaries.
has disputed the legitimacy of the Ukrainian government since the United States and NATO funded the removal of Viktor Yanukovych from office. It funded Ukrainian nationalists and neo-Nazi groups to fund what was called the Orange Revolution, or Euromaidan, and since then has said that NATO has had an undue influence over Ukraine. Now, one can make the argument for Ukraine joining NATO and that being part of their self-determination, but my opinion is NATO already treats it as if it is a member of NATO, and I could see how, in terms of Russian interest, that would very much anger it. Also, Viktor Yanukovych did sign an agreement to join the Eurasian Economic Union, which is a Russian-led economic union. It only amounts of 3 to 4% on any estimate of the world's gross GDP. But nevertheless, it's an economic union. It has common external tariffs, much like the European Union does, to protect itself. Clearly, there's a lot of resources that Ukraine is one of the biggest external exporters to the EU. So if there's a common external tariff on a lot of the things that Ukraine imports, then that would obviously be a huge problem for the European Union. I think the reasons for Ukraine's treatment by Russia over the last going on 7-8 years is relatively understandable. And also, when you talked about the Donbass region, there were various citizenship campaigns and domestic policies that were put through by subsequent Ukrainian governments. One of them was a citizenship change, so people that had Russian surnames had their names changed and Ukrainianized. So, for instance, if you're called Vladimir, your name would be changed on your passport and on your legal documents to Volodymyr. I don't know about you, but I wouldn't particularly like a government changing my name on ethnic grounds.
That's really interesting.
It is interesting, but there's another. This is common. This sort of situation. I mean, let's look at within our own country. Of course, this week has been the anniversary of Bloody Sunday, where British soldiers killed innocent civilians in Northern Ireland, and there has been this would be the equivalent of Ireland invading Northern Ireland, and many in Northern Ireland would not mind that at all, but many in Northern Ireland would be very angry, and ultimately it would be a foreign state invading another state that's territory is not recognised internationally. If the people of East Ukraine wanted to join Russia, that should be done democratically, you could argue, although of course, as you point out, perhaps the Ukrainian government wouldn't allow that because it'd be against their own interests, wouldn't it?
Well, for me, the constitutional integrity of Ukraine has been undermined since 2014 because there was a constitutional way to, as there are in all republics, to remove prime ministers and presidents. Instead, the US and NATO saw it fit to actually be quick about it and force someone from leader into exile in Russia. And when he was in exile in Russia, Viktor Yanukovych built up a huge movement of support for people that live in the Donbass region of Ukraine, and then swept in from the east. So very much you can have domineering foreign policy from the West, but look what it gets you. You now have ethnic and regional conflicts throughout the region, and some of the apathy that you talk about. Some people are just so despondent with the whole arrangement that they don't care anymore. It's sad that we have to see people that are just their lives have been so tarnished by all of this that they simply live in a state of nihilism. I feel for them very much.
Any last comments, George?
No.
No, we done. Well, all very interesting tensions going on over in Ukraine and Russia. On a different point, we lost Meatloaf in last week. Great singer, and so as homage to him, this is Meatloaf's song "Alive." Unfortunately, Meat, you're not still alive. Bit tragic, really. But you're still alive in our hearts, mate. Keep on rocking.
That's what you'd say.
Okay, welcome back to the Big Picture. Our third and final part of today's episode is on Islamophobia in the Conservative Party. So, former member of the government, Nazgani, has said that when she was dismissed from a reshuffle, in February 2020, she was told by, she didn't identify the person, but Mark Spencer's later said that this is him that she's referring to, that's the chief whip. She said that her Muslimness was a reason for her to be sacked. And at the time, people were surprised that she was sacked from the cabinet, bearing in mind that she is a Muslim woman, which is rare demographic to support the Conservative Party. Also, she was Brexiteer, very critical in China. In fact, she's one of these MPs that has been reprimanded or barred by the Chinese Communist Party. You can't ever come into China or we'll arrest you. So she's saying about that this has been Islamophobia against her. Now, another Muslim woman in the Conservative Party that served under David Cameron, Baroness Wazi, has said that Islamophobia in the Conservative Party and indeed the wider country has become a sort of dinner table. It's past the dinner table test, which means you can say whatever you really want about Islam and there won't be any consequences about it. The Conservative Party's been long accused of Islamophobia. Of course, Boris Johnson as well has been accused of Islamophobia after he wrote an opinion piece that comparing Muslim women to letterboxes, the burqa to letterboxes, and that did result in a 375% increase in hate crimes towards Muslims. Does the Conservative Party have an issue with Islamophobia, and what should be done about it?
Well, yeah, no, I think they definitely do have an issue with it. The funny thing about this, well, not funny thing, but the interesting thing about this was it in 2019 when Boris Johnson first came to power, he set up like a panel.
Yes,
he was pushed to do that in one of the debates.
Sajid Javid, who is of a Muslim background. He doesn't identify as a Muslim anymore, but he comes from a Muslim background. Yeah,
so in 2019, and obviously this lady, Miss, what was her name? Nuzgani has obviously, she's gone to Boris Johnson and been like, there's an issue, there's an issue here. I was sacked because of this reason of Muslimness, and Boris Johnson's just turned around and been like, oh, I can't really get involved. I mean, you're the leader.
Well, do you think that he said that because obviously recently we've had another party being investigated for racism, the Labour Party, with anti-Semitism, and one of the complaints that was held against Labour was that Jeremy Corbyn's office regularly intervened with the complaint process to favour people and to let people off the hook for anti-Semitism. Do you think that might have swayed Boris Johnson to think, I'm not going to get involved, refer this to an independent panel and let them investigate it, and I'm not accused of interference? Do you think that might be one of the reasons why he did that?
Hang on,
well, it's a logical reason, but I'd like to say that the story here is not necessarily that in and of itself. The same reason that when they tell you to buy instant roast coffee, you don't buy it. When they say skim milk is as good for you as full fat milk, you don't buy it. When Gwyneth Paltrow says intermittent fasting is good for your health, you don't buy it. Why has it taken this person, this guy, 2 years to come forward with this information? If this really was an act of reprehension at the treatment she faced, why is it taking 2 years? But in her defence, on the other side of it, I can also see that the fact that the lack of transparency in the Conservative Party's complaints process is very unclear. Something else I tried to research for this. I don't see any reason why that couldn't be made public, and I think it would do them a lot of favours if it was, because then we could actually see where the truth of this matter is. And also the other thing that I think is just farcical, and I don't even have necessarily an opinion on this, but she made the initial complaint and then posted about it on Twitter, but didn't actually name Mark Spencer. And then Mark Spencer came out and said, "I'm the person that she's talking about." I'm struggling to see here. I'm trying to sort of connect the dots. If you're looking up with a journalist hat on, as to why he would do that, what political manoeuvring was going on there.
Possibly he's just getting ahead of it because maybe he thinks that this could be part of people trying to drip feed the media and stab Boris repeatedly over a long period of time. Do you reckon that could be the case?
Well, this is the thing with the 2 years time. 2 years it's taken Nasraq a guy to come forward with this. That's what I'm sceptical of. It makes you wonder about your motivation, because the whole blackmail thing that you're talking about. William Ragg has already spoke to a parliamentary committee about this already. Christian Wakeford's already gone forward, and Chris Bryant MP, who's on the Common Standards Committee.
He's Labour.
But he's on the committee because it's a multi-party parliamentary committee. He said he's interviewed at least 12 Tory MPs at the moment that have come forward into this committee that haven't been named yet, as far as I'm aware, about this. So again,
I think there is Islamophobia in the Conservative.
Yeah, I'm being asked. No, about blackmail.
Blackmail is something. I mean, this is the thing of people going, wow, blackmail. But the Whips have been doing this in the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, the SNP.
Politics is blackmail
forever. I mean, this is something they've always done. I mean, there were stories in the 1980s, and I can't remember his name, but there were accusations of the Labour chief whip would grabbed a backbencher by the testicles, threatening them to support the government. So this is an ongoing issue. Doesn't mean it's right, but it's not a new thing. Do you think then with Nazgani that, I mean, she claims she didn't come forward earlier because she was threatened that if she did, that she would not be promoted into ministerial office?
Which is blackmail.
Blackmail, yeah. And do you think that she is now coming forward now because the Boris Johnson government is weakened, and she's not doing that as a tactical move because she is actually an ally of Boris Johnson, or at least was. It's not a tactical move to undermine him, but she just feels like she's now in a position where she can say this without being attacked by people in her own side who might accuse her of being a liar. She has got the support of Sajid Javid and Nadeem Zahawi, interestingly. So that could be an awkward cabinet meeting with Mark Spencer. And you asked why Mark Spencer did it. He claims, again, doesn't mean that there's ulterior motivations, but he's claiming that he's done it because he didn't want any of the other whips for this to be put on them when he knows that he was the one that was talking to Nazgani upon.
Yeah, I think your first point's really interesting. And I have to say I agree, because obviously in criminal cases with historic child sex abuse, people don't feel the confidence to come forward unless a group of people do, or unless they've already been brought down. And that could be that's a completely fair point. I can see why she's come forward now, and also the point you were both making earlier. I'd just like to qualify this, but most people that work in politics are psychopaths. So they could quite turn around on her and say, oh, you're just saying it's blackmail, and she's actually got a legitimate complaint, and they're just using that current story and then feeding her into that. Who knows really? Obviously, you spoke about some disappointment about the Sue Gray report not coming forward. I think this is another story that needs to unfurl. I remember a little bit in the last few days. It sort of started to fade out of the news agenda, but I think it's actually it's an insight into the entire functioning of Downing Street, something that we've not really had much insight in for the last 2 years. So yeah.
And there is an inquiry now on this as well. So the government's got 2 different inquiries going on. And do you think there's an issue that Islamophobia in the Conservative Party, if it is allowed to continue, that it could be on the same scale as anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, which of course ripped the Labour Party apart in terms of its reputation, and of course, you had 9 in 10 Jews saying the Labour Party was a government would make them feel unsafe. Do you think that that could happen to the Conservative Party? I mean, it's not there yet. But we might be seeing the Equality and Human Rights Commission looking into them as well.
Well, they did a report back in May. It wasn't a full-scale investigation or inquiry, but there was already a report. They found that I think it was 2/3 that the Guardian reported. It was around 2/3 of complaints of discrimination were either anti-Muslim or Islamophobic. But they also identified within the report that the way in which those complaints were dealt with the same as complaints against other discrimination of other backgrounds and faiths or what have you. So that was then, and then this comes out now. Would that give remit to have a full-scale inquiry? And also we've got the issue of the definition of Islamophobia. All the other parties have adopted the all-party parliamentary definition on Islamophobia, but an internal investigation into the Conservative Party which has not yet adopted that.
Well, finally, the question really is there is a distinction between discriminating people based on their religion and legitimate criticism of religion.
Yeah.
And it, of course, how religion may in itself not be as socially liberal, arguably, as
I agree. I much prefer the term.
Balance.
I much prefer the term anti-Muslim. I think it's far more accurate, really.
Because Islamophobia, are we saying fear of Islam itself, or fear of Muslims?
And don't forget context as well. Was any of this about a debate on Islam? It was not. It was not that.
Likewise, anti-Semitism.
This was someone saying that someone's quote unquote Muslimness made them was unfit for office. And I don't like to use the term Islamophobic. I think it's far too vague, and it's been developed and curated by political interests that actually do have some quite extreme beliefs under the umbrella of Islam.
And it's of course across both sides. It's not just a right-wing problem. There are plenty on the left that also disagree with definitions of religion phobias, which end up passing through law, it being wrong to criticise religion, which of course is a breach of free speech.
It's one of these issues conflicting, isn't it? Rights conflicting with other rights. And you mentioned there about on the left, the Labour Party's also been accused of Islamophobia. And recently, Keir Starmer's had to refuse a donation from a previous, I can't remember his name sadly, but he was a donor under New Labour, and the comments he'd made about Islam had come to light, and Keir Starmer then had to, after pressure was made on him, had to refuse that. Of course, there was Rod Little, who writes for The Spectator now, but he was a member of the Labour Party and he was expelled for Islamophobia. So there's an issue in the wider country as well as the Conservative Party on the issue.
I think you can be grown. Sorry.
Go on, last point.
No, I was just saying, I think you can be grown up within this specific argument and this specific this type of event, is that you can be very adult about it, and you have to simply look at the context. The context was not a debate around. If someone's having a debate or having a discussion around a particular faith and has a criticism of its practices or its scripture, then of course one would endorse their right to do that. But the fact is, this was not what the conversation was about. This was about someone's appearance and ethnicity and faith making them unfit for office. I don't quite like the sound of that. It's a little bit creepy.
If that's the case, that's a very sorry state of affairs.
Yeah.
And disciplinary action, serious disciplinary action would probably have to occur against Mark Spencer if it's found to be true. Even maybe expulsion, I don't know. Thank you for listening to the Big Picture today. Thank you to George and to Damien for coming on.
Thank you.
I've been Felix Hawes.
And I've been Thomas Gregory.
And playing us out in a hopefully in a more loving world is Take That, A Million Love Songs. Thank you very much for listening.
Bye.
Bye.